many years ago in working with pilots as to what is situational awareness. Situational awareness really comes out of the aviation domain, but it has spread rapidly into a wide variety of other areas. And what we discovered is that situational awareness is more than just knowing a bunch of stuff. At the first level, we have perception of the information. So this is basically, how do we get that information that's needed across to the person who has to make the decision? They have to, whether they, hear it, see it, smell it, whatever. It's your ability to gather and understand that data. But on top of that, what we call level 2 situational awareness is the ability to comprehend or understand the meaning of that information. It's the so what. And we see in a lot of environments where people may see a cue, they can see trampled grass, for example, but they don't necessarily understand the meaning of the impact of what that meaning is for what's going on in that situation. And so comprehension, it's I liken it to a reading comprehension test, but it's sort of the so what of that information when it's all integrated and put together. And at the highest level, we find that people are able to project what's likely to happen in the near future. And this is the highest level of situation awareness. And it's that ability to anticipate or project what's happening that allows people to be proactive rather than just reactive in decision making. So as an example, if we're talking about emergency management type situations, there's a lot of different kinds of data that people are trying to gather. What's the type, scope of the incident? Where is it impacting? Where is it safe? What are the geographic boundaries perhaps of the problem? What types of hazards exist? Where are resources at? Where's the command post at? Where are your different teams at? Where are staging areas? Where are displaced people or casualties that have to be dealt with? This is all the data that you're trying to gather and get an accurate assessment of. The so what of that information, the how do you develop meaning out of that is that higher level assessment you're trying to make. Things like, what is the safety of the people and infrastructure? How is weather having an impact on the escalation of the event or on our response efforts? What types of incident command structure might be needed? What's the difference between what supplies are available and what's needed? How severe are the injuries? What's the priority of services to different groups of people? Those are the higher level assessments that you're trying to make. And then the projections really have to do with, how is this going to change over time? What's expected in terms of increases or decreases in casualties, the personnel requirements, projected weather impact in the future, or the projected impact of your solution on the resources you have available. These are the types of mental calculations that are often having to go on in order to make accurate, proactive decisions. Now, these are just some examples. But one of the things that I think is very apparent about disaster response is that it's not just one decision maker making one kind of decision. There are actually a lot of different teams that are involved in disaster response. Anything from firefighters, search and rescue teams, that could be military teams that are brought in to help with large scale events, law enforcement. You have your healthcare teams, public health officials, non-governmental agencies, and then families who are looking for loved ones or people who are displaced. I mean, they are actually a part of the problem space that really has to be dealt with, because they are both a part of what's going on, but they're also a source of information or disinformation, and they're demanding information. So I think that's another group that really has to be considered in these types of events. All of those people are trying to make decisions. They all have a very specific set of information needs associated with those decisions, and then they're trying to make comprehensions and projections. They can be very different depending upon the goals of that particular group, what they're trying to do. And one of the challenges is often coordinating this information stream across those different groups, sharing information effectively. And one of the things we see is that the same data can mean something very different in terms of comprehension projection to different groups. So there's a need to be able to share those higher level assessments and plans. If the firefighters are anticipating, the fire is going to be increasing in a certain way, that information has to be communicated to other groups who could also be impacted by it, for example. Unfortunately, there's a lot of challenges for situational awareness in these types of operations. First of all, people are often dealing with a very highly disrupted environment. So our maps, our building diagrams, they can be completely wrong or misleading because those structures can all be affected by the event itself. Our critical infrastructure that we rely on, things like the internet, could be down or spotty. Phones can be down. A lot of the types of systems that we might want to depend upon for information, gathering information and sharing information, can actually be affected by the event itself. Secondly, I think human chaos is a major player in what's going on. There are many people who are affected by these events, either directly, they're part of the injured or missing. We have families who are actively searching and seeking services. They're looking for their loved ones. They are clamoring for attention. All of these things become part of the problem space. Increasingly, social media is getting relied upon as a part of that process. So they become, it's good sources for both getting information, but also sometimes a lot of incorrect information. So it's a bit of a mixed blessing when it comes to situation awareness. And then we have the problem of bad actors, people who are taking advantage of that chaos for their own ends. So, you can have gangs, you can have people who are looting, people who are taking advantage of others. This becomes a whole part of the problem space. We have highly distributed resources. So there's a lot of different organizations, as I mentioned. Each one of those can have parts of the problem space here in terms of resources that can be brought to bear. But oftentimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand has, and vice versa, in terms of where are these supplies, shelter, medical care, where is it available as compared to where those people are. I'll speak about emergencies we've had in the US just because I'm a little more familiar with them. But for example, during Hurricane Katrina, we had a large portion of the country where that was affected by the hurricane. The NGOs and the responders who were going into that environment couldn't communicate at all in terms of where people were who had problems compared to where people were who had solutions and services to provide. There was big disconnects in that kind of environment. And then I think the other major factor associated here with situation awareness is just the challenge in communications and information sharing across response teams. In 9/11, we had, of course, a major failure of the information technology that the fire teams relied upon was different than the comms technology that the police teams had, for example, and they had trouble just doing basic communications. We've done a lot of action to try and repair that situation since then, but still, we can have, when we look at all the different teams that are involved. This can sometimes be a problem when people are relying on different systems or technologies, whether it's verbal communications or the systems that are basically depicting where your resources and your teams are and everything. And often we find that people are poor at information sharing across those teams. There were some good studies that were done about 20 years ago looking at how people communicated during disaster events. And one of the things that study found was that as workload increased and stress increased, people tended to communicate within their team a lot more and not across teams. And so those natural kinds of events that are happening can actually decrease effective information sharing across teams, for example, particularly if your information systems aren't compensating for some of that. So these are common challenges. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, and there are many of you who would add a lot to this list, but at a high level, it's a very challenging environment to be working in. Now, one of the things that I created is what I call SA Demons, and these are common challenges for situation awareness across many different kinds of domains and systems. These are common challenges that we see, and they're really problems with how people process information, how they gather information from their resources, and how those things affect people's ability to develop situation awareness. And I'll just cover these very briefly. But of course, one of our biggest problems is information overload. There is, in your environment, I think you have problems with both underload and overload. So there's both not having the information you need, but a lot of our technologies and systems that are out there provide a lot of low-level data that quickly overwhelms our ability to gather and take that information. People have a limited bandwidth for taking in information, and if it's a lot of miscellaneous data, it can be very hard to sort through all that to get what you need to know. And so people get overloaded very quickly. Another problem we see is attentional narrowing. And this happens a lot, particularly under stress and workload. And what happens is as you are sorting through all the data that's out there, you tend to focus in on a very narrow subset of it, particularly when you're under stress or high workload. And what happens then is that a lot of other very relevant information can get neglected or not paid attention to. And so this tends to reduce situational awareness in these kinds of environments. So when you have your response team that's out in the field, there's a lot going on. They may focus in on one person or one problem and to the neglect of a lot of other things. And what you find in problems with situational awareness is that a lot of those other things they need to have been paying attention to could have actually been more important. But because they've lost that broader perspective and they're narrowing in on a subset, that they're not able to balance and juggle those priorities effectively. Requisite memory trap is a problem in many fields. I don't know how much it affects you guys, but in a lot of systems, people are required to remember information and then spit it back. So they're required to remember a code, and then you have to enter it over here in this other system, or you get a lot of information verbally over the radio, for example, that you have to remember. And that's very challenging for people. People are actually good at a lot of things, but short-term memory is not one of them. And so it's very easy to forget critical information. Particularly if we have to rely on it auditorily, that can be a real challenge. So to the degree that we can present information visually, you have good information technology resources, the better off you are in being able to juggle that data overload that's present. Another one of these demons is what I call WAFOs, workload fatigue and other stressors. And generally, whenever you're under high workload of stress or fatigue, what happens is that acts to sort of reduce the amount of working memory you have for processing information. So it makes gathering and understanding information much more challenging when you're in those situations. You try to reduce those things where possible, but I think when you're in disaster response, it's just part of the problem space. So we have to recognize that that's the case. And again, anything that's loading down memory, people are going to be poor at. So we need more help in gathering it, in having visual support for that information, and in processing that information so you're not overloading people. Misplaced salience is a problem on a lot of displays. I call this the Las Vegas Strip syndrome, where there's just a lot of information competing for people's attention. And that's because they don't do a good job of presenting the important information with highly salient cues and your lower level information with not as salient of cues. Complexity creep, the more complex our systems are, the harder it is to correctly match cues to what's going on in memory. So systems that have a lot of features, you're going to have problems with in terms of understanding what's going on with those systems, and being able to correctly match cues to what's happening becomes more and more problem the more complex those are. And then the outer loop syndrome. And this is what we get into with things like automation and AI, where if things are happening automatically, people are basically out of the loop. They have lower situational awareness for understanding what the system's doing, what the information means, to be able to oversee it correctly. So these are really common problems we see in a lot of systems. And so what we look for are ways of designing systems to avoid these kinds of problems and support people's ability to gather and interpret information effectively. In looking at what kinds of problems people have, we've looked at this in a variety of situations. The majority of the time, they're just not getting the data that they need. It's out there somewhere, but it's not getting passed from person A to person B, for example, or the data could be occluded in the environment. It's particularly in these messy environments, it's very hard to get the data you need. In another 17% of the cases, we found that people had the data, but they weren't able to put 2 and 2 together to get 4. They weren't able to comprehend what was going on. And then we find that sometimes even when they do that, then they're not making the right kinds of projections. Now, this doesn't mean comprehension and projection are easier, because they're not. But what it means is that if in a lot of our systems we're even failing to get the basic information to people, then they're never going to get around to being able to do comprehension and projection. All right, let me talk a little bit about team SA, because I think that's really important in this environment. So far, I've just kind of been talking about SA at the individual level. Team SA is basically the ability to all of the team to be able to understand what's going on. So if you have, let's say, 3 team members, each one of those has specific assigned duties that they're working on. And if the person who needs if one person has the information, for example, but not the person who needs it, then you've got a failure in situation awareness at the team level. Everybody has to have the information they need for their particular role. And often this is what we see in these kinds of environments, where that information isn't getting effectively transferred to the people who need that information. That you end up with suboptimal performance, obviously, your team. There's also a lot of focus on sort of the overlap in this Venn diagram, and that is the information that needs to be shared across the team. So that's the information needs we have in common based on the overlap between our particular goals. If you're the firefighter, for example, communicating with the healthcare worker, or the fire or the policeman, there's some overlap in what you need to know, that what I'm doing affects you or what you're doing affects me. That information has to be shared and communicated properly. And that's really a lot of what we focus on in terms of these common operating pictures, is the ability to support the shared situation awareness needs. But that needs to be done in a way that doesn't overload the rest of the team. So in this case, people really have to be focused on trying to be on the same page so they can do coordinated action. And so they're really looking at sharing information about the status of the event, what's been done so far, what's going on now, how what they're doing is going to affect me, how what I'm doing is going to affect them, and what are people going to do next. And these are some of the key questions that are associated with trying to build that shared situation awareness across these teams, particularly a challenge when they are distributed teams. So one of the real challenges we see for situation awareness in these team environments is that because people have different goals across these different teams, they have different mental models that they use for interpreting information. Even if they're looking at the same environment, they can get completely different understanding of what's happening in that environment. And we find in these teams that people tend to communicate low-level data, but not necessarily those comprehensions and projections. And that's where these teams get crosswise, is if they aren't sharing those higher-level assessments of what's going on. So we see failures in shared SA in terms of, one, are people gathering and understanding the critical cues in terms of what's happening in that environment? Are they clearly passing it to the other people who need that information? Is the information being interpreted in the same way by different teams who, again, are going to have these different mental models for interpreting information? And then are they making the same kinds of projections in terms of what's going to happen in that environment? These are areas where we see shared SA kind of fall apart across these distributed teams. And looking at how we try to address this, there is a model of team situation awareness that looks at how people develop team and shared situation awareness. And the first thing that has to be done is first of all, you have to identify what is it people really need to know. You have to go in and do a detailed analysis of what each team needs in terms of data, but also comprehension and projection. And look at what has to be shared across these teams so that you can build your information support systems in a sensible way. Secondly, we find that this idea of mental models becomes really important. If you work with somebody very frequently, for example, you can actually be on the same page by only communicating a little bit of information. Like if you travel a lot with somebody or if you work with them a lot, you already have this sort of this shared understanding of what's going on. So your likelihood of interpreting that information is the same way is quite good. If, however, you're working with people you don't work with very often, if they come from very different backgrounds, it takes a lot of communication to overcome and compensate for the fact that you're going to interpret information very differently. So this idea of shared mental models is really important. One of the ways we develop shared mental models is through joint training, for example. If your teams have worked together a lot in the past, they're going to be much better in terms of being able to rapidly interpret information that they perceive using these shared mental models. The second thing that becomes important are these team processes. And these are processes for coordinating with each other, prioritizing. We've done studies looking at what teams are better at developing situation awareness across the team. And they do things like self-checking with each other, coordinating. They prioritize and set up contingency events. They, as a group, practice questioning, sort of as a positive way to make sure, this is what I think is happening. Is this what you think is happening? There's a open information sharing environment. And so there are skills that can be trained into your teams to help them be better at developing shared situation awareness. And then, of course, there are the devices that we provide. Sometimes if you're in the same environment, I don't have to communicate with you what's happening because you and I both see the same information. But a lot of times we're not in the same environment. And so we have to rely heavily on communicating information and on shared displays, whether they're visual or auditory, for helping to communicate that information across that team. What we see in these distributed teams, though, which is what you have to deal with in your emergency response operations, is that people are separated by distance, they're separated by time, they're working different shifts, or there's just physical obstacles in their way. And so they lose a lot of these kinds of cues. Their SA needs are still the same, but typically in these distributed teams, they don't have shared mental models because they haven't been working together. They haven't trained together, so they don't have these effective SA mechanisms, SA processes in place. And they don't have the advantage of either shared environments or nonverbal cues. So we put a really heavy burden, a heavy load on verbal communications and on our displays. But I think up until recently, there really hasn't been a lot in the way of shared displays. It's only been with the advent of advanced information technologies that we're now getting better tools, whether it's phone apps or apps that are on our tablets or command centers that help us to gather and integrate that information. What we look for then is ways of getting a lot more effective in how we gather and interpret that information on those shared displays. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move ahead here. We're just going to focus on the technical system here. There is the social system, which is really what we can do to support improving team processes through SA training. And then ideas of safety culture, which are relevant a lot of times. I'm going to focus more on the technical system and what we need to do for SA design in order to make those technical devices support your situation awareness needs better. What we have found is that one of the reasons we have basic data overload in these systems is that technology has taken us from very manual processes to having a lot of information on computer displays. But people are still really challenged in finding what it is they really need to know. And I call this the information gap. It's this big gap between all the data that's being produced, but people still have to sort through it, find what they're looking for, integrate it, process it into what they really needed to know to get what they need. And this is what leaves people overloaded and challenged in these kinds of environments. And one of the reasons is that people are often living with what I call technology-centered design. And that is, you may have in your command center, multiple technologies, multiple displays, each of which have been producing parts of the picture that have been gathered from different sources, but it's not really integrated well, and it's not really translated into what you really need to know. So people are still sort of juggling and fighting through that information. And that the answer to this is really a user-centered design philosophy. And so what that says is, let's take all of that information flow that's out there, all those different technologies, integrate that information around what it is each decision maker really needs to know, and then present it in ways that are very quickly understood and assimilated. And that's what gets us out of these problems that I've talked about, out of those SA demons, and into a much more manageable situation for human decision making. The way that we do this is through SA design. And Raj mentioned earlier, we have a book on designing for situation awareness. I think he has the second edition of that book. He'll be happy to know the third edition is going to the publisher next week. and it'll be out by the end of the year, and it provides a much more updated look at how we can apply essay design. But basically, it's a 3-stage process. You go through and you very carefully assess what the situational awareness requirements are for each of the roles that are involved in that operation. We have design principles for how you present that information effectively to support situational awareness. And then there are approaches for essay measurement that allow you to rapidly evaluate the effectiveness of those displays for situational awareness. And I'll just give you a few quick examples here before we break for questions. But basically, the way we do essay requirements analysis is a goal-directed task analysis. And we look at what are the key goals of each decision maker, what are their decisions that they're making, and then their essay requirements are really a function of those decisions. So situational awareness isn't knowing everything about what's going on. You don't need to know the guy's shoe size or something. You need to know the key data that's associated with your decisions, the assessments, the comprehension you're trying to make, and the projections you're trying to make. And so the GDTA goes through and it basically defines that. So this, for example, is for an incident commander. His main goal is safely conducting and managing the response in order to mitigate the effects of the incident. He's got 6 major goals here, from assessing the incident, establishing a response plan, managing the incident management team, ensuring the safety of displaced persons, response personnel and property, optimizing the use of assets and resources, and effectively coordinating with stakeholders and outside agencies. Those are the main goals that incident commander has. And then there are sub-goals associated with each one. And when you break down the GDTA, then for each one of those sub-goals, then here are the key decisions that person's trying to make, and that defines their essay requirements. So it's a very systematic way of going through and defining very clearly what each person in the team needs to know. This was for an incident management person. There would be others for emergency response teams and other teams that are involved in your operations. But you get the gist of being able to have this systematic way of defining what people need to know. And that gives us a good way of determining who needs what across teams, so that the information that they need can be directly gathered and integrated and presented to them. Your common operating tools can make sure you're not overloading people with everything in the universe, but it allows you to design those tools to be carefully filtered, the kinds of information you need to know. And what we really try to do is to integrate it and present it in ways so that you don't go 6 places for one decision. All the information for one decision is in one place. All the information for a particular goal is in the same place, and you're not having to go across displays. We try to make sure that the information is interpreted. So you're not sitting here trying to figure out comprehension and projection in real time while you're under all this stress and a lot of things happening, but the tools do a lot of that integration and presentation for you. And this is really what's behind these SRN design principles. So when we design these systems, we've got 50 design principles. They include general principles, like I was explaining, but they also deal with common problems for situational awareness in these environments, dealing with uncertainty and confidence of information you're getting. In every domain I've looked at, how confident people are in the information turns out to be a unique essay requirement all by itself. Very often that information doesn't get provided in displays. So you really want to know, how old is this information? Where did the data come from? Is it a trusted source? Is it, do I have high confidence in it, or is it old information and it these sensors are fluky, or it comes from an untrusted source? There are a lot of principles for how we deal with that and how we present that information to communicate people's how much confidence people should have. There are principles for dealing with complexity, alarms, which is a big problem in a lot of domains where there's too many alarms and people get the cry wolf syndrome. Dealing with automation, and then directly supporting team operations, where we're trying to effectively share and create a shared essay across these teams. More and more unmanned vehicles are a part of disaster response, whether they're ground vehicles or air vehicles. And there's a lot of good examples of how to apply these to those situations, as well as SRN training. So I'm not going to have time to go into these in depth, but I just kind of wanted to give you the big picture of how we go about supporting SA in a lot of these environments and using a very principled approach to both understand what the SA needs are of people in those environments, to be able to design the systems, information systems to support them, and then be able to very effectively test them. One of the things we do here is to not just say, hey, I think this is great, use this system, but we test it with users to say, is this really giving you the SA that you need? People are often asking me, should I buy this system from this vendor or that system from that vendor? And the answer is, not necessarily. Just because they say it's, mine's the greatest thing since sliced bread for situation awareness, it may or may not be, until you really test it with users and you can get objective data that says, yeah, this is really supporting their SA needs. Then I take those things with a grain of salt. The other thing that we do, of course, with that testing is when you do have good testing, you can see where the challenges are, where the problems are, and you can iterate your design to make sure that people are getting what they need. So I have a lot of other slides here, but I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to break here and let's go ahead and take questions.
Thank you, Mica. And as people try to think of their questions, there's already a few questions in there, and I have a few of mine as well. But let's start with a question from Gavin. And I guess looking at what are some of the challenges and potential solutions in terms of scaling from an incident that may be within 1 square kilometer versus say a 20,000 square kilometer. So how can we scale situation awareness across different multiple orders of magnitude?
Yeah, so that certainly is a problem. And the way we typically scale in these organizations is you add more people to the problem space, right? So if it's this very small space, you may have a 3-person team who's solving this problem for one traffic accident and one problem. If it's a wide scale problem, you've had a hurricane or typhoon wipe out part of the island, then you have a lot more responders coming in to deal with it. So that's typically how we scale. From the challenge of situation awareness, then the problem is managing all of that. So more people means more hands, and that's terrific. But you get into these problems of shared situation awareness across this distributed team that I was talking about. We find that people who are on the ground, people who are performing tactical operations, they may only need to have SA about what's happening in their very small small scope. But people farther up the chain at higher levels of the echelon, then they're dealing with more strategic operations. And so they're looking at different kinds of things like, are the right resources in the right place? Are we prioritizing events? They're looking much more strategically. And so you have to do those goal-directed task analyses to really understand those SA requirements for different teams and at different levels of the echelon. And again, tailoring that information to allow each one to do the job that they're called upon to do.
Thanks, Mica. I think that's really great to hear about that scaling. And just like I really quite like the goal-directed task analysis and kind of framing your requirements from there. But as you mentioned, there are also like multiple teams, just like as you mentioned, you might have teams on the ground and teams on the strategic level. Can your this GDTA also account for the different goals each of these teams may have, and how does that kind of work?
Yeah, so when you do them, you do one for each specific role. So, your firefighters on the ground, well, you would do one, but at higher levels of the echelon, you would do more. For example, we did this with military command and control. We did 110 different GDTAs across different Army roles, all the way from an infantry soldier up to a brigade command center. And those really allowed us to focus in on the specific SA needs and requirements for each of those people at different levels. In emergency response, we've looked at different ones of those. For instance, we've looked at them for UAVs that are doing search and rescue operations. We've looked at them for teams that are responding to WMDs. You do them for each individual team. And that's what really gives you the information that allows me to say, here's the information that has to be shared across teams or up the echelon. And it allows you to do that in a very focused way, as opposed to just, here's a whole bunch of data and you guys figure it out, which just creates the data overload problem that we've talked about.
Thanks. So we have a question from Emma, and she's saying that, a really great presentation. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on the way we can rapidly bridge gaps between people's mental models?
Yeah, so that's really a challenging one. When teams have worked together and trained together, we show that they develop more shared mental models. Cross training is another good way of doing it. So particularly when you have these teams who are coming from very different places, do you do joint exercises that involve multiple teams doing things so that they can build that common understanding of, oh, this is what these guys are doing. This is what they need to know. Here's how I need to interact with them. Those kinds of joint exercises are really the best way to do this. Now, staging those are big, they're expensive. We can't do those very often. So the other way we can do this is in simulation training environments. And we're seeing more and more people are moving to simulated exercises that allow people to develop these kinds of understanding of what's going on in ways that are lower cost. And you can put people through lots of different scenarios and help them build these shared mental models of what's happening.
Yep. Emma, do you have anything to add? Because I might have not read the second part of your question.
Kia ora, thank you, Mica. Yeah, my question was around if you don't have the opportunity to do that training beforehand, and you're in a situation where you've got two people with quite different mental models about a situation, do we have any thoughts from research or training around how to kind of communicate effectively when people really do just have really different mental models of a situation?
Yeah, so obviously building them in advance is nice, but that's not the real world. And particularly not when a lot of these teams are ad hoc. And so they may be coming in and they haven't had that opportunity. You've got to cross those boundaries. One of the things that we've seen that helps make a difference is communicating comprehension projection. And so, I'll say, well, it's 8 o'clock. Well, to you, that means it's too late to do something. To them, they don't know what that means. They haven't interpreted that the same way. So you have to be very explicit in saying, it's 8 o'clock, this closes at 2 o'clock or at 8:10. And so we won't be able to do this until 2 o'clock tomorrow or whatever. You have to be able to explicitly communicate comprehension and projection, because you can't expect that they're going to get the same so what out of that data that you are. That's one of the things that helps significantly, so that they can sort of formulate those things. You're often looking to develop an understanding of, if I do this, how's it going to affect you, or what you do, how's that going to affect what I'm doing? We have to be better at sharing those very explicitly, and those projections of how those things are going to change, because you just can't assume people are going to get it. They don't.
Yeah, that's super useful. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question that on the different concepts or I guess terms people use, and what are your thoughts on concepts such as common operating picture, sense making, situation awareness? Are they similar or different? And how do they place in this kind of value chain, and how people can respond better?
Right. So situation awareness is knowing what's going on so that you can make effective real-time decisions. That's basically what it's about. Sense making is a slightly different term. Sense making comes out of the organizational psychology literature, a fellow named Weick. And what they were trying to do was to look at organizational events and say, what is, how did this come about? What went on here? And so it's making sense of what's happened. It's usually post hoc, after the fact. And they actually relied on models of situation awareness for looking at how people do this more at the individual level in a real-time sense. But sense making was always, I think, a little more post hoc. Situation awareness actually includes sense making, but what you find is that for that comprehension projection, a lot of it's automatic. It's instant. You're not even necessarily thinking about it. We only are trying to make sense of events when we don't quite understand what's happening with it. And so it's more of that conscious deliberation part of it. But a lot of times situation awareness is very automatic. So I think situation awareness is a bit broader than the sense-making term. The other question you asked me was common operating common operating pictures. So this is a term, these were very popular in the military community, and because of that, they flowed over. I think that term has flowed over into the emergency management community because there's a lot of overlap there. And the idea of the common operating picture is, we're all going to have this one common picture. A lot of times it's a big screen display in your command center, and people say, "Oh, that's my SA display." And that always kind of makes the hair on my head stand up a little bit, because no display has situation awareness. No system has situation awareness. Situation awareness only exists in the head of the decision maker. It may be a tool that helps our situation awareness, or it may be a tool that kind of messes it up depending on how well they've developed it, but that's just part of the picture. And a lot of what people are doing is they're not just relying on, whatever's coming out of this display on the wall, but what they're getting from all these other sources, what they hear from the person next to them, what they're hearing over the radio, what they're getting out of the news media, what they're getting out of the social media. There's a lot of sources of information that people are gathering and integrating in their head, and that's just one piece of it. If we did a good job of integrating it and putting everything in there and tailoring it to just what you need, then maybe it would produce a lot of it. But I haven't yet seen a system that I would say, "Oh yeah, they're really covering it all." I think we're always going to have to integrate that information with a lot of other things that are happening.
Thank you. And of course, there's the question of AI. So what do you think is the role of AI now, especially that it's becoming a thing, and especially with the current trends with generative AI? You also mentioned earlier about, the concept of being out of the loop, and, this potential conflict or
Yeah.
role of
So-
AI in this.
Yeah, so I'm called on to talk a lot about AI these days. I actually started studying situation awareness because of challenges with AI that we were working on back in the 80s. And basically the problem is that people expect that AI is going to improve operations. And, you can go to the web and you'll have all kinds of people telling you that this is the greatest thing, it's going to make everything all better. The challenge is that AI is not really all that intelligent at this point. I don't think it will be in my lifetime. It's just another advanced form of automation. It doesn't understand information. It doesn't understand what's going on. It's really a good pattern matcher. It's a statistical pattern matching algorithm. That's all these machine learning programs are. And they can find patterns in data. If you have really large data sets, they're good for that. But they don't understand. They don't have any kind of common sense or reasoning. They don't know their own limits. So, a good example is, if I don't know how much our news hits you, but there was a cruise automated vehicle in San Francisco that accidentally ran over a person who had been knocked down by another car. It's AI told it to, if there's an accident, move to the side of the road. Well, it moved to the side of the road, just dragging this poor lady across the road, because it doesn't have any kind of common sense. It doesn't understand how to make exceptions for understanding what's happening. Unless it's a very specific situation it had already been trained for, it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't do that learning in real time. And so while automation helps with a lot of routine tasks with AI, it can do some things that are good, but it also increases the likelihood of these catastrophic errors. And that's what we see in a lot of our data sets. And so basically what we find is that AI is not going to be able to handle a lot of things. They have really problems with perceptual limitations in gathering data accurately, particularly, and I would say, in these disrupted environments. It's got brittleness. It only understands what it's been trained on. There's a big learning lag to adding new data to its training database. Hidden biases are a problem with a lot of these systems. So it's very biased on the kinds of environments it's been trained in and the data sets it's been trained on. And if it gets something that's different, it can't handle that. And then I think even if we handle a lot of those problems, it does not have a model of causation. And there's a lot of good research in the AI community right now about the need for causal models. So as I said, it's just a statistical pattern matcher. It doesn't understand cause and effect. And unless you have that, you can't do things like project what's going to happen. And so when you get something really unexpected it hasn't seen before, it's not going to be ready. It's not going to manage it. It won't know the difference between these boulders in the road and a tumbleweed going across the road. It does not know the difference. That's going to be a problem. And we have a lot of we don't have time to go into it in depth, but there's a lot of information on how automation negatively affects situation awareness. Everything from the out of loop problem we've talked about. There's a lot of confusion in terms of people understanding what it's doing, why is it doing it. It can increase cognitive workload. It can it increases the likelihood of these catastrophic failures. So there are real challenges with AI. We're working hard on trying to develop improved interfaces for them to make them more transparent, which they're currently not. But I think until these problems are met, we need to use AI very selectively and very carefully for a few things. But if you're expecting it's going to be, a good recommender system or a good system for doing things automatically, I think that's going to be a real problem in a lot of these disaster response environments, particularly since the environments are so disrupted.
Yeah, thanks, Micah. I think that's really great to see your thoughts on this. I think that would have answered Yasir your question on AI, and or if you have any follow-up on Micah's answer, yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you would want to. Oh, okay, so I think that you have answered Yasir's question. So thank you. So another question from Alicia. So can we hear some recent or classic scenario where situation awareness was well implemented?
Well, I think a good one to that you're probably familiar with is what we call the Miracle on the Hudson, where Captain Sullenberger was able to land a plane that we had both engines get taken out by a bird strike after he took off from an airport. And he was able to successfully land the plane on the river. Now, what's interesting about that was, not only was he calm and collected and was able to do that, but something was really interesting about Captain Sullenberger that people may not know is that he was actually a glider pilot in the Air Force, and he trained glider pilots. So he was very knowledgeable about how to operate a plane that had no engines. That gave him the knowledge base to be able to make these assessments of, well, how far can my plane go with no engines and from this altitude. And so when the air traffic controller said, hey, land at this airport, he was able to say, nope, can't land at that airport. He was able to quickly assess, nope, can't make it back to the airport I took off from, because he understood those dynamics. So that's a great example of having a good mental model that gave him the situation awareness to make those kinds of comprehension and projections based on what was happening. The other thing that I think was really interesting about Captain Sullenberger is that he was the he was the air safety chairman at his airline. And so as the safety chairman, he was very familiar with a lot of accidents that had happened. And there are videos of people trying to do water landings. And one of the problems that always happens in a water landing is one of the wings dips and then the waves get it and the plane tumbles and falls over. So he knew when he had to land on the only thing that wasn't, heavily crowded around New York City, he had to land on the river. He had this sort of knowledge base of what he had to do, even though something he had never done before, what he had to do to make it a successful landing. So I think that was a really good example of somebody who had good situation awareness, not by accident, but because he had this background that allowed him to really assess this very novel situation that he was in.
Thank you. I guess one final question, and we'll end with this one, is what do you think would be the role of researchers, but also as I guess government agencies to enhance situation awareness? Maybe just a final note on this, on our role, because people online, they're either academics or practitioners, and so maybe it's a bit of inspiration on how do we move forward. Yeah, thank you.
I think there are so many ways, and to me, those answers are working together. I mean, any one group working on their own is not going to have all the answers. You have people who really understand their environment, they understand their challenges, they understand their needs. And then you have, I think, your researchers who can help bring together this research base that's been done in all these different environments that's very relevant. So we didn't get a chance to talk about, but there's been a lot of work looking at how do we train people to be better at situation awareness, both as individuals or as teams, that you can develop unique training programs that are tailored to your individual needs in doing emergency response. I don't think any of the tools that I've seen out there yet are really giving you the essay you need to be able to do your job effectively. So this is another place where these teams can come together and custom design tools that are going to fill that gap and really help you with developing that information that you need. doing joint exercises, helping with evaluation. There's a lot of ways that I think your teams can come together and really create leading solutions in this problem space.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to speak on behalf of all the audience of thank you for your presentation and great answers to the questions as well. We also want to thank everyone who came online, and it's really great presentation. And on behalf of our team from the Crisis Lab Joint Center for Disaster Research, thank you for spending time with us, and really great opportunity to discuss with you and learn from you, and to break down the concept of situation awareness a bit further. And hopefully it inspires us to work together better although we're all part of different teams, but to really work towards enhancing situation awareness in different contexts. So thank you so much, Mica. Thank you for taking time for us. And I think we're seeing a lot of applauses from the audience.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and good luck to you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really good. What a good speaker.